these sounds. So how about I send you a demo which has a couple sounds in it, basic drums, basic instruments, and a vocal, and you just do whatever you want and just produce it out and make it as good as possible. So what I did, I listened to it and told him, yeah, I like the vocal, I like the performance, but I don't like anything else. Like I don't enjoy the drums a lot. I don't enjoy the instruments. They sound cheap and they sound kind of cheesy, like super plasticky. Here's what I can do. I sit down and I talk to each and every client. I'm like, hey, I can provide this. If you want to, out of my expertise, I would say this is the best thing for the song. And whatever goal they have, what he wanted is to have a song that you can perform live the best. It also played on the radio later on, actually like a week ago. But he wanted a live performance song with lots and lots of elements they could play live, like lead sounds, like vocal chops, stuff like that. So for each and every artist, it's different because their goals are different. Some people just want to have a 3-minute radio smasher. That's it. Like make it as Charlie Puth as possible, but make it as mainstream as possible at the same time. So I need to take that into account. But I give suggestions based on that. And I told him like, yo, I will produce a dope song out of your vocals. Just trust me on that. And he did, because he's seen what I did already on Instagram and my portfolio.
Right. Your message is really clear, you know.
Thanks a lot. So we produced the song out. I was actually done in a week, which is super crazy. But I liked the song. I was listening to the scratch vocals and I had the idea instantly. Like I had the idea in my head like that. And I produced it out over like 3 days, sent the demo over. He loved it. And then we made some couple of changes on his account. And that's it. I finalized it and was done. So that's kind of the process. Each and every time they give me at least something to work with. And even if they don't have something to work with, I can start from scratch, produce something out, and have them top line to that later on. So they would say like, hey, I love your style. I like you to produce something that sounds kind of like this with your own influence. Like let's say let's say they come to me and say like, hey, I want you to produce a song that sounds like Troye Sivan, but still has your funkiness into mixed into that. That's like 3 minutes long and has this amount of energy and kind of this BPM. I would listen to their vocals or like their releases, and if it's something that is right up my alley and fits my style, like, okay, I'm gonna do this. So I sit down, produce something, do like a skeleton scratch track, send it over. If they like it, they top line it, we produce it out, we mix it, done.
Amazing. Do you have a go-to instrument or sound bake that you use to kind of get the ball rolling, or is it more spur of the moment?
Over the years, pretty much have my sample packs and have my go-to instruments laid out already. I don't use a lot, actually. I have lots and lots of plugins actually bought. I actually spent over 800 euro last year only on plugins, which is ridiculous if you might consider.
Yeah.
But the good thing is I can get back some of it through taxes and
sure,
not the entire thing, but some of it. But I needed it. I bought a bunch of UAD plugins, stuff like that, which I don't even use right now, which is funny. But for my go-to instruments, I always have Diva, which is this analog modeled synthesizer by a German guy, and it has
UHE.
Yeah, which stands for Urs Heckmann, which is the guys who invented the whole company, started the company. So Diva is my go-to synth. It's pretty heavy on the CPU if you put it onto the divine mode, which is like the super crazy oversampling mode for the oscillators. But it's actually the most analog sound in synth, and it's actually like a combination out of 5 different synths. So it has like a Jupiter, a Juno, Oberheim filters. You can model it how you want, like a mini Moog as well. That's my go-to synth, and then bunch of good samples that I sourced over the last couple of years, and Contact actually, because for funk you need lots of brass, strings, vintage Rhodes. So Content is big, and of course my all-time favorite for keys is Keyscape. That's my latest
keep hearing
acquisition.
Keyscape over and over again.
Because the quality is actually, it's there. Once you try it, and me, myself, as a pianist, I know how a real piano sounds like. And if I ever played, it actually sounds as one of the best pianos that are as authentic as possible, but at the same time as usable in a production. Because sometimes you get those huge orchestral libraries for pianos, which sounds amazing by themselves, are good for scoring.
But they don't poke through.
they don't poke through. They're not as applicable for what I do, unfortunately, or fortunately.
Right, the Keyscape has like a bright sound or something.
It's very snappy, very snappy.
It's like kind of like a Yamaha.
They have multiple, like they have a bunch of pianos sampled in there. They have like the G7 Grand, then kind of couple upright pianos, Yamahas as well, Rhodes, Wurlitzer, Celeste, stuff like that. Like a good selection of high quality instruments. But I like the overall sound, but I also like the customization. For disco and dance stuff, you always want to crack the velocity to the max. So it's like sounds like static, but still like punchy. That's the secret. If you're listening right now, and if you want to know how to make super good dance pianos, just crank the velocity to 127 and don't look back.
Awesome. That's a hot tip.
That's a hot tip, exactly. Buried into the podcast.
Awesome. So take us on a tour through the creation of a typical song you normally work on. I guess you kind of already answered that question.
Well, for the production itself, like here's the thing. I have a very unique production approach to songs. I explain my production process, how I do it with a client, which is pretty straightforward. He reaches out to me with some material. We sit down over Skype, talk about it in depth, and then collaborate until it's finished. But the production process itself for a song is kind of very unique for me. So the secret behind all of my production stuff, and of course that's nothing that I invented, but I barely know people in the whole entire world who do that, maybe like 2 or 3 people. What I do is, and my background is French house, which is mostly sample based. So you would go and snatch a 70s record and sample that, splice it up or like loop it up and build a new song. So what I do is I basically first of all produce a 70s funk band. Like an authentic 70s funk band for like 16 or 32 bars. That's like the ideal sample in my head. So I would start with like keys. As a pianist, I'm very chord based. I like to play chords, harmonies. I start out with a harmony, produce that out, layer up a funky Moog bass, and produce it as vintage and 70s sounding as possible. So that means lots of bit reduction, downsampling, tape saturation, distortion, all of that goodness, as if the whole production would happen in the 70s, as much as possible, because they would, work on actual desks, leave API, whatnot, go into transformers, preamps, everything gets tracked to tape. So I do that as vintage as possible. And I do that for like 16 or 32 bars. I export as a wave, then I import it back into the project and I sample myself. So I splice that up, basically like an 8-bar loop, pitch it up like people do, like in a French house or like hip hop. What people do is they sample records, they pitch them up, they apply all kinds of filtering to that, creative filtering, so it sounds like kind of warbly and filtering. If you overlap, like I duplicate it mostly. I have like a high cut and low cut and like analog style filters, and I add a little bit of filter drive. The Ableton auto filter is actually great for that because it has like the Cytomic modeled analog filters from the Imp Oscar, from the MS-20, from the Korg, and some kind of permutation out of those. So I apply those, and the warbling in between the low and the high cut on a sample creates like this kind of funny vintage sound to it. It's very unique sounding, and nobody does it because it's a 2-step process. Nobody wants to produce one song and then make that song into another song because that's kind of twice the work. But the result I'm having is so unique that almost no one has it right now. Like I don't hear it anywhere else. I hear like kind of bits of that somewhere, like people doing it occasionally, but doing the whole process is cool because I'm coming from this background of sampling 70s records, but since you can't do that right now because it's of copyright reasons, of course, and like getting samples cleared is a pain in the ass, honestly, and it costs money as well. But it also gives me the most flexibility for the sound because I can go back and change a chord, I can change an instrument. I have the most control over the sample that I want. Sometimes I even remake kind of steal chords out of 70s records and kind of make a new version out of it, like a cover, but then actually sample it so far that it doesn't even sound close to what it sounded originally. So it's a whole journey combining combining like vintage techniques. That's all I stand for basically. Like if I write the copy on my sign that I combine like vintage sound with like modern production techniques, I actually do that. I combine a vintage sampled approach to with like modern production techniques. Not every time. Sometimes I do just straight up the modern production and that's it. But like 90% of the time, I'll do that for all of my funk stuff.
That's awesome. Well, I've never heard that before. And it'll be like a unique song that you're sampling every single song. Meaning like each song has its own sample song.
Yes. For each and every new song, I produce a unique sample. It all sounds kind of similar because I still use the same instruments and I have my go-to like polyphonic pad that I always use and my go-to Moog bass. And I have like my bell sound. They kind of the same, but that's my
so you're using
style.
Like are you using templates to do this?
I have one template where I have just a bunch of instruments preloaded. So I have like contact libraries, like my session strings, my session horns, my vintage horns preloaded, but I don't have like any MIDI. I don't have nothing on the master actually, because I know what I will put on the master, but I want to experiment each and every time. Maybe put a different saturation on the master. Maybe use a Fairchild instead of tape. I don't know, just so it doesn't sound the same each and every time. But overall, the instruments that I use and also the chord progressions, they're very similar. The movements between the chords, I try to keep it as similar as possible because that gives me like
that vintage vibe.
Yeah, that unique sound that people like.
I want to get a little bit more into templates. Do you have templates also for the main composition or for mixing or things like that?
For mixing, I do have a mixing template because first of all, I mix in Ableton, which is also unusual. Like people,
I've noticed that. Yeah,
people love to mix in Pro Tools and I do have Logic for recording and comping. But
Logic's comping is unparalleled.
It's great. Just stack that up, choose the best parts. There you go. That's a feature I'm missing on Ableton, of course, and all of the Aura integration with Melodyne and
let's not talk about that because I still don't trust it enough to do Melodyne, ARA, and Logic. But I'll cut this out.
But Vocaline, I would like to have Vocaline at least in Ableton, the Aura. Which we don't. But since everything else, just the quickness of the browser and just the stability of the app itself, and I just know it in and out, just every little thing.
That's the most important thing.
I'm super fast with that. Let's put aside the debate of like which DAW sounds the best because that's bullshit, of course.
Right.
Because people used to say like Ableton sounds way worse than Logic's engine. I'm like, come on, get the fuck out of here.
Right. It's all the same.
It's all the same, honestly. And even if there's some slight difference, I'm not able to hear that actually, and neither do you or anyone else who says that. But Ableton is my go-to mixing DAW, and I always like to have. So in Ableton, what you can do is you can group your stuff, and then you can save those as channel strips, basically. So for everything, let's say for main vocals, I have a channel strip that I combine out of different plugins. Let's say I have a gate, then I have FabFilter, then I have my go-to 1176 into the LA2A, and then some coloring EQ at the end, and a twin tube maybe to saturate. And that whole chain I can just group into one thing, like one plugin, and save it in a folder, and just straight up pull it up anytime, or just put in the name into the browser, let's say vocal processing chain, and it just comes up. I press enter and just pops up onto my channel, and that's basically it. So I have a bunch of those. I have my go-to processing chains for vocals, for bass that I know work every single time. I just need to to adjust the values,
tweak it as needed.
Exactly. But on my audio channels, and I have usually like 100 preloaded in a template, I always have the Softtube console, which I'm super into right now. So that's my first plugin, which already has like a gate, equalizer, compressor, and like a drive section. So I have those preloaded on the first channel, and that's kind of my go-to. And on the master, I always have some kind of at least the SSL by Acoustica, which is the Sand, my favorite one right now. And some kind of tape and a limiter at least, because I like to mix into something on my mix bus. Even if I don't end up mastering this thing, which does happen because I don't like to master right now. I like to mix stuff, but I like to mix into something that gives me the glue and kind of like sense for dynamics from the beginning. So